Hey everyone, Dr. Clark here. Let's talk about another way that you can help prevent autism. And some of the ones we've already covered in our series is breastfeeding your child, avoiding plastics and chemicals. And today what we're going to be talking about is yeast infections. So you're a woman, you're thinking, how the heck do I avoid a yeast infection? Why does that even matter to preventing autism? Well, yeast, there's not just vaginal yeast infections. There are intestinal yeast overgrowths as well. And I'm going to tell you something, they cause a whole heck of a lot of problems. I mean, probably 30% of the people that I see in my practice that have chronic neurological or metabolic problems often have this intestinal yeast overgrowth, and it's what we call a Candida problem. Now, you can go Google all this, but here's the bottom line. Yeast can implant into the lining of the gut, your gut lining, and cause an inflammatory response. Now, when you have an inflammation in your gut, you're going to have inflammation in your brain. That's period, end of story. The research and science is already there to prove that. Now, why does that matter to you? Well, if you're pregnant and you get an intestinal yeast infection, not just a vaginal yeast infection, you're automatically increasing the chance that you are going to have inflammation in your nervous system inside your brain. And that environment of inflammation is not something that a developing baby needs to grow in. There's a whole lot of stuff we don't have time to talk about, but the name of the game is we're trying to reduce inflammation. So how do you avoid having an intestinal yeast infection? Well, the number one thing you can do is avoid sugar. Yeast love to eat sugar. Now, sugar comes in a lot of forms, right? We've got, the simple carbs. We've got the breads and the pastas and those sorts of things. And yeast love to eat those things. The other thing you can do is avoid sugar. Candies, Cokes, all those things. That is just a perfect fuel source for a yeast in your intestine. Now, if you're wondering how you find out if you've got one of these things, there's some little kind of, hokey test you can do. Like some people say, you get up in the morning, and you spit into a glass of water, and if it is all stringy and then that means you've got a yeast infection. I got a much better idea for you. You can do a DNA test of your stool and find out if you've got a yeast infection. You don't have to spit in a glass and hope you've got one. Now, some of these little recommendations I'm going to give you are going to help if you've got a yeast infection, or if you don't have yeast infections. You're going to feel good. So first thing you should do is you need to avoid sugar. You need to drastically cut down on carbs for a lot of different reasons, or some of which are related to adrenal gland health. But for yeast loves sugar. The other thing that you need to do is make sure that if you're going to take antibiotics at any point during your pregnancy, which I really hope you try to avoid, you must replenish the normal good bacteria that live in your intestines with probiotics. Now, I'm not going to give you any particular brand recommendations because there's things here at the office that I use that I think are totally appropriate. But the point is, you need to be taking probiotics because antibiotics kill everything. They kill all the bacteria. They're indiscriminate. It's like a big nuclear bomb that goes off, which is okay if you've got some sort of bacterial infection, I suppose. But it's horrible for your intestines because those bacteria, the good guys that live in your intestines, they're like the glue in the wall that is your intestinal lining. They're part of the defenses that you have. And so yeast, which are kind of living in everybody, are kept in control and kept under wraps by these good bacteria. That's why when women have an course of antibiotics, they get a yeast infection because they already had the yeast, but when you use the antibiotics, it killed off the good guys, it balanced them out, and then you have a big problem. But when you're pregnant and you're trying to avoid and decrease the chances of your child developing a syndrome that could be called autism, you've got to avoid sugar. And I will also tell you that you need to avoid other things that will promote intestinal inflammation. You need to do things that will decrease the inflammation in your intestines that you might not even know you have. And of course, number two thing, I'm going to suggest that you go gluten-free because gluten is a huge factor in most of the people that I see. It's not necessarily the cause of all their problems, but it's certainly a huge factor. And going gluten-free and being pregnant is totally possible. My wife did it, and I did it along with her, so it is doable. Now, you may need some help, but it can be done. Now, the third thing that we want to talk about is, we already talked about it, didn't we? We talked about sugar. We talked about going gluten-free. And if you're going to have to take antibiotics for whatever reason, you must take probiotics immediately afterwards to help replenish the normal bacteria that should be living in your intestines. Because remember, the whole reason we're talking about yeast is we're talking about an intestinal yeast infection. And you can find out if you've got this by doing what's called a stool microbial profile. It's basically a DNA test of your stool. And if you've got the DNA of these Candida living in there, we'll know it. But the reason that matters is because Candida cause inflammation in your intestines. And if you have inflammation in your intestines, you have inflammation in your brain. And brain inflammation is not something you want to have if you've got a developing baby growing inside you, because you can really set off a cascade of bad chain reaction of things that can cause them to develop, have abnormal brain development. So takeaway message is no sugar, go gluten-free, and if you're going to take antibiotics, definitely use probiotics. And if you want more information, just give me a buzz or shoot me an email. This is Dr. Clark. We'll talk to you soon.